What's up, world? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like right here at I Mix What I Like. I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. Have a great special interview with Mr. Tom Porter that is being offered yet again to channel members and patrons first. So thank you all very much for your support. And to those seeing this later in its full release, please reconsider those life choices. Among many other things, Tom Porter is my godfather, longtime friend and comrade of my father, Leonard Ball, with whom he helped co-found and build the Cincinnati chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. For more on that history, check the many interviews at imixwhatilike.org. But in addition to that, Tom Porter has never left the activist community. He has been active in any number of grassroots formations, advancing Black and other radical politics. He was a longtime host at WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C., where he was a pioneer in both the jazz community and the political world and merging them on radio. He has a long career as a rare jazz record salesman, book and record store owner, and someone who has been, again, very active with the jazz community and really what is properly understood by him and others as the Black classical music community. That is, jazz has been somewhat of a contentious and imposed term on Black classical music, as he and others have called it, but someone who has been very active. And as you'll hear, he will be talking about some of that, including his political work on the campaigns of Jesse Jackson in the 80s. Mr. Porter has been, he's been the head of the King Center in Atlanta. He was a friend and confidant of the King family, including Coretta. The experience is endless. Helped found a grad school in Black Studies at Antioch College. In fact, I think they called it Advanced Studies. The resume is again extensive, and plus he's just a reservoir of knowledge and good humor on top of it. So, in advance, you're welcome for this great discussion and interview. Thank you all very much for your support of the platform. As always, peace only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And enjoy. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Let me just get your first thoughts of the film. When you're asked, Mr. Porter, what did you think of soundtrack to a coup d'etat? What's your elevator pitch answer to that?
Well, I've seen the film 3 times, and each time I had a different reaction. The first time I saw it, it was a great film. No emotions about it. It was just a great film. I enjoyed the music. Um, the second time I saw it was in a different setting, and it was still. But the third time that I saw it, which was this past Saturday at the African Film Festival, I had a really emotional reaction just at the criminal nature of all involved. Eisenhower, Dag Hammarskjöld, uh, the Belgians, Mobutu, Tshombe, and what's the other guy's name?
Kasavubu, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it just reminded me of today. From that standpoint. In terms of the music itself, I enjoyed all the music, but I wasn't clear which musicians, according to the filmmaker, participated willingly in the assassination of Mobutu. I mean of Lumumba. And which ones weren't, although I'm sure you know,
You think any of them would have been? You think any of them would have participated, consciously aware of how they were being used to cover that?
I don't think so. Not even Louis Armstrong. And I'm not sure whether, say, Eric Dolphy or Thelonious Monk participated even in the State Department tour,
Mm.
or Max Roach, who was very militant and progressive. So, I mean, like playing Monk's Just a Gigolo with all of these white racists in the back. I thought was
Yeah.
I thought was pure genius.
Mm.
Uh, but overall, I thought it was a great film. One of the best documentaries that I've seen. Uh, Certainly, uh, I think it for a lot of people who saw the movie, they weren't really aware of the role that our culture, artists, not just musicians, but fighters. I mentioned that that whether Muhammad Ali knew or not, that there were three of his fights that were clearly a part of U.S. Uh, imperialism. The rumble in the jungle, the thrill in Manila, and the fight in Venezuela. And I'm assuming that I think it was Herbert Muhammad who took over his management. And I'm sure that he engineered those willingly. I don't think, uh, I mean, I think he would have known who Mobutu was or Marcos
So
was.
that part, so that you've said that to me in various ways for years, that the that there was an uncomfortable, put it that way, relationship between these fights and State Department politics, US geopolitics. But what I've not considered, admittedly, is the role or the awareness of either Don King or, in this case, Herbert Muhammad. And I don't remember when the trans who was in control when for
Right.
which fight. Um, I do remember in the Rumble in the Jungle that Don King was heavily involved in, like, because I remember we watched, like, for instance, watching When We Were Kings, the documentary about that fight with Foreman in 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 Congo. I don't remember anything about Herbert Muhammad, but I know Don King was all over
And I
that one.
might be wrong with that. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
um, but I'm
But
not wrong. I'm not wrong about the role of the fight in the State Department, or Don King, who uh, comes out of prison with a $5 million fight gate. I mean, how does that happen? I
yeah,
mean,
I'd be very much interested in, you know what, and I'll ask folks. Our undefeated chat will likely put something out when they see this, so maybe we'll get some responses
and you
there.
know,
But I'd
Don
be,
King was very
you know,
conscious about his how he saw politics.
mhm,
Only in America.
only in
You
America,
I mean,
only in
Don
America.
King would go to a fight back in one fighter and he'd leave back in the other fighter had won. I mean, Don King didn't have any cut card at all.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but so 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 in terms, so that's, so you mentioned something, you said something about what folks would and would not get who saw this. One of the responses that I've gotten from some of my comrades around here has been that when I initially praised the film, that I was projecting what I've already understood about certain politics and histories onto the film, and that the film doesn't actually elicit or draw those out for those who might not be aware. And I definitely was more conscious of that when it came to the artists involved, and that I don't know enough about the artists and their politics and what they were not doing, or were not aware of with this, or what they were not doing separately, politically from what we see in the film. And that, so I did want to ask you if you had any thoughts about, or could say a little bit more about what those artists were more likely to be conscious, or what you were aware that they were conscious of politically and involved in politically. And I'll ask, let me just do it this way. So, for instance, the film, one of my problems, and it took me a third viewing to really catch this. One of my problems with the films is that it frames with the Abby Lincoln and crew takeover, or interruption at the UN. They sort of bookend the film with that, really kind of ultimately, in many ways, liberal and performative, if not inspirational, action. In other words, that sort of limits the radical political and the militancy that would have been involved in those time in those times, and today even, and would have been part of people's organizational goals or political goals that we don't see in the film. And it just leaves us with a response to assassination and colonialism and African independence and the suppression of it, with this idea that some artists sang some songs, a couple people ran up into the UN, even threw a couple of blows, and then that was really it. How does that fit with what you understood about the politics of that time and the artists involved, and what they may or may not have been aware of or doing outside of those moments that we see in the film?
Well, first of all, I mean, the reaction to Lumumba's assassination around the world was very visceral, and and the action at the UN was just part of what went on up in Harlem. There were hundreds of people in the streets of Harlem. I mean, I remember that 1960-61 period well. It was the year that I got out of the. I was honorably discharged from the Navy in October 1960. So, and it was. I mean, Max Roach and Abby Lincoln, they had been in the forefront of militant artist activities for a while. And in fact, the music came from Max's "We Insist Freedom Now." They had interrupted, I think, the Ed Sullivan show, but it was a time of tremendous awareness in the African world. I mean, all of the footage about Fidel being up in Harlem, and I mean, interesting enough, the same activities that we saw with Lumumba and Nkrumah and Sekou Toure, we're seeing the same thing now. The quest for a united Africa has always been something that the radical Africans, the progressive Africans, had pushed for, and we see it now with the brother from Burkina Faso.
Sure, yeah.
Interesting enough, he was just accused by Human Rights Watch of engineering a massacre.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but Human Rights Watch, I mean, they've been known to be, you know, State Department people. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't know enough about that, but I all I know is that I'm, well, one, I was interested in your thoughts of that the point you raised earlier, the connections between what you see happening today with what you were what we saw in the film. But because when I see Traore and the other efforts in the AES and in the Sahel, I get excited. I get inspired.
very
So I
definitely.
hope, yeah. So, but yeah,
We hope that the same thing does not play. I mean, the assassination of Thomas Sankara was not too long ago,
yeah,
and so we. But the musicians, it was a mixed bag. Uh, uh, Louis Armstrong was not a militant. Uh, musician, but he was not the Tom that people try and make him out to be. I mean, it's a complex situation which has to do with the direction of our movement. Our movement, when I think back, even on my own activities and the things that we were involved in, a lot of what we were involved in was trying to convince the people who had oppressed us, who have had and continue to oppress us, that we were worthy of getting in on the enterprise. And so I think from the standpoint of the State Department sponsoring activities, many musicians, artists, and people saw that as a plus, that the government is recognizing our worth. And even the State Department is giving us some money. And for musicians who don't make a lot of money, I mean, some of my favorite musicians participated in State Department. You know, Duke Ellington. I mean, I don't know all of the ones who got, you know, State Department grants. It's kind of like MacArthur. MacArthur decides who's a genius and who's not a genius.
And they're always right. Of course,
Yeah,
they're always right.
and give them enough money uh, to be able to be geniuses, because nobody else has the money to go around, and they get more money. You know, they get more money. I mean, they gave, and I will not name the organization, but they gave an organization $500,000. They stopped short of calling the head of the organization a genius, and right away he had took the money to try to have a great big meeting to bring all Black people together, because it didn't go anywhere because of his history. So, I mean, but they gave him $500,000. There was no reason to give him $500,000 because they don't really do anything but have a podcast.
Wait. Who? I'll edit this out, but you got to tell me who this is. Who are you talking about?
It's clear that Barack Obama had at least one, maybe two, why they brought him forward. People keep forgetting that in 1984, when Jesse ran for president, he was number 3 out of all of the candidates, all the way up to the end, which would have given him a seat at the table, maybe even leadership of the Democratic Party. That was why the whole Jaime anti-Semitic thing was there from the very, very beginning. The JDL interrupted Jesse's announcement in the DC Convention Center. And in the early days of the campaign, myself, Florence Tate, and Jesse, we were the road team. We were traveling around the country. This is before he got Secret Service protection. And it was the Nation of Islam that provided us security, because the JDL was harassing us every place we went. And Jesse never said Jaime in a derogatory way. He just said, that, New York is Jaime town. And I mean, the Jews don't deny that. But even more, the first time we were in New York and we were meeting with, I forget, but it was a significant Jewish organization. And Percy Sutton met us backstage with a yarmulke on his head, telling us how we had to behave. So,
did any, just quickly, did any prominent efforts from the Jewish community at the time step up to say to defend Jesse in that moment? Do you remember any, or was it just wholesale condemnation?
No, it was. I mean, clearly, when one looks at, you can't paint the Jewish community with a broad brush and say that they're all like Netanyahu. There is a sense of solidarity, even with friends now, when I talk about who are Jewish and I talk about Palestine. They know it's wrong. They say it's wrong. But, well, clearly we see presence of a lot of young and old Jews involved in protesting what's happening in Palestine. I don't remember that there was a condemnation of that, because I think most people didn't see it. I mean, it was. I mean, you had to be. I mean, this is early in the campaign,
But
and
even I remember it becoming. I mean, I was young, but I even remember it becoming an issue, and that it was something that had to be responded to and was used against him. And really, what I was asking, the reason I'm asking is that what has always frustrated me about these conversations is that for whatever could be said, because I'll be honest, whenever I hear reference to it, I just accept that Jesse was trying to be demeaning and derogatory to regarding the relationship of Jews in New York to politics, struggle, et cetera, and so forth. But that I don't think that should have been enough to sink his effort or to negatively affect his effort in any way. And I don't know, and maybe it didn't. But
but
so I was asking, like, in my point being that were there certainly progressive, if not just honest members of the Jewish community, it would not be difficult for them to say, look, we understand we have some difficult relationships with some of our black brothers and sisters, and that we need to step up in enhancing and evolving that relationship so that these kinds of issues don't pop up. And then, by the way, we'll have a conversation with Jesse and then continue to support him because this is the campaign and the politics that should be supported. Like that would have been what I would have hoped might have been part of a response from an advanced thinking segment of the Jewish community. And I just don't know if any of that took place or to what
I don't
extent.
remember any of that taking place.
Yeah.
But the problem with Jesse that some segments of the Jewish community had. Remember, they interrupted his announcement when he announced that he was running for president. It had to do with the relationship between segments of the black movement with the Palestinians.
Right.
I mean,
right.
I was on a trip to Lebanon where we met with Yasser Arafat. We were guests of the PLO. And on that trip, there were ministers. It was Jack Odell, but Jesse's wife was on the delegation. So the relationship between the Palestinians, or progressive relationships, but particularly in the Middle East, relationships with the Palestinians, any relationship is for some certain segments of the Israeli political establishment is a problem. So Jesse, just so you know, he was not demeaning. Jesse had these way of characterizing, like, for instance, we'd be in the South, and he referred to whites as Bubba, blacks as Moles. I mean, that was Jesse, and but he never in the campaign attacked. And the fact of it is, nobody ever heard Jesse say Town. That's interesting. It was her. It was there were segments of the white press who picked up that Jesse said that, because he never said it publicly. He never said it publicly.
Yeah, I'm just
And
finding a New York Times article from '84 where, to your point, it does say here that he acknowledged after he did end up acknowledging that he said it, but it was initially in a private conversation. That
I mean,
Reverend Jackson acknowledged tonight that he had used the word Jaime in a private conversation to refer to Jews. But
you
yeah,
know,
but to your point, no one. Right. Yeah.
nobody. But so what happened is Milton Coleman, who had been an editor, one of the editors of the Post, had been the person who was the editor on the Janet Cook. Janet Cook wrote this article about this about drugs or something. I don't remember the article, but it was a fabrication. She didn't witness any of that. So he kind of got demoted, and he was brought forward. This is what I think he was at the time, because he was black, although he never heard Jesse say it either. Uh, and uh, and I mean, for instance, Catherine Graham's daughter was alleged to have heard Jesse say that. Now, the one time that Jesse met with her, I was there, and Jesse didn't say it. So, I mean, and then there was pressure that, I mean, there's a lot of different politics going on. It's the Democratic Party politics.
So, but that's sort of again my point, and this actually confirms my initial thought even more. Jews, good, bad, indifferent, all know that in private conversation, all types of things are said by all types of people about
Including
all types
them.
of people. That's my point. That's exactly my point. So this
Right.
idea that all of a sudden it's time to clutch our pearls and turn this into something. Now, I think to your point from a moment ago, this didn't end up having and he had, he ran 2 campaigns, so it didn't, and then has had this other career, so it didn't destroy him in the way, but in part maybe because it was so difficult to attribute, a source or whatever. But my point is that that's what I'm saying. Any honest, certainly progressive intervention on behalf of Jews or anyone else would have been like, all right, I mean, okay, everybody, you know what I'm saying? We'll have a conversation. We'll ask him to apologize and let's get back to business because his campaign and his politics are the best that we want to work with. But to your other point about the real issue of Zionism, looming in the background in the relationship of Black liberation struggles to the Palestinians is more likely to be the issue. But that's sort of what I'm saying. Like we just never get overt, honest, public conversation about many things, including this, the relationship between black communities and Jews. Yeah.
And we're not. But I mentioned that a lot of it had to do with internal Democratic Party politics, and Jesse was. I mean, there was no other candidate in 1984 who came near to like raising the issues or raising the hell that Jesse was raising. I mean, he was a very clever politician. For instance, we were in New Hampshire, and they said there were no poor people in New Hampshire. So Jesse decided to give out food. People were lined up around the street, around the block.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
We found some poor people, even in New Hampshire. Imagine that.
And the reason why I said it had to do with internal Democratic politics, because there was a transition that took place in the Democratic Party. That's when Bill Clinton and the Southern governors formed the Democratic Leadership Conference, took the leadership away from the party, but they hired all of those people. Donna Brazile, all of them came out of Jesse's campaign, all of them. The Democratic Party hired all of them and marginalized Jesse. They hired all of them, gave them fancy titles, deputy director of the Democratic Party, when they were not even it's like Colin Powell said, he was a national security advisor. They had meetings that he wasn't invited. So it was that kind of thing. So the thing was to marginalize the impact that Jesse had. I mean, he really put together a coalition, a populist coalition. I mean, even with the the Posse Comitatus. I remember being in Great Bend, Kansas, and these the early versions of the Proud Boys.
Oh, right there.
Had a rally for Jesse and took up some money. So I mean, he was a threat, and Obama, but Jesse was a threat because he was building on the history of the movement. I mean, he was building on the Poor People's Campaign. In those days, there was a unity between the Latino Hispanic community, the Asian community, and the poor white community. And so, you saw it with Fred Fred Hampton. So so uh, Obama's role was to negate that. He was very negative towards the civil rights movement in a very nuanced way. Called Dr. King a simple country preacher. Yeah, he was quite interesting, and and he did that. He did that well. I mean, his policies were no different than Biden's, and internationally, in Donald Trump. I mean,
No, that's true. That's exactly right. So,
so
but if we can, I do want to come back. I do want to come back to the film a little bit.
right, right.
Uh, although we just have to have you come back again for another conversation specific to the politics of the day, and I would like to do that. So sooner than later. But I did, it in we've had around here a couple of friendly debates about soundtrack, and initially I was defending it because it tapped into my bias around, in particular, defending, as you pointed out, and promoting that there was this effort at the United States of Africa under scientific socialism. There was, and it the film seemed to give a primacy to African liberation and independence, but a couple of my comrades have suggested that it has actually been it did that only to the extent it was taking shots at world communism, and that the film was quietly trying to position itself in a more liberal lane as not pro communist, and did that even if again, to my bias, leaned into African nationalism, liberation in the United States of Africa. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and any thoughts about, again, that time and how
Yeah, yeah.
artists even but
I
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
mean, I would say that appears to be a. Let me choose my words here. That would appear to be what was happening, but I think that it also could be coming from a lack of knowledge of what was happening historically in that period. One of the weaknesses of our movement has always been uh, this uncritical notion of black nationalism, and and if you follow the evolution of Malcolm X, who is the person that most nationalists see as the patron saint, and I I don't disagree with that, but Malcolm evolved in his thinking and his understanding. And as he got outside of the Nation of Islam, he was free, unfortunately, for just a short period to really express some views and what have you. So that the movement was split around the struggles in the African in Africa. And as one of the things that Dr. King said in the speech honoring Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, was that our blind anti-communism has led us into one quagmire after another. He also said in that speech that Black America would never be free until a long night of imperialism is lifted from Asia, Latin America, and, and Africa. So that sometimes it's a lack of understanding. The Soviets played a very pivotal role in the liberation struggles on the right side in Southern Africa.
So just to be clear, sorry for the interruption, but just to be clear, I'm thinking specifically of my homeboy Mtume, and Mtume was not looking to was actually, and he'll correct me if I get this part wrong, but was actually wanting to say that the film, he was saying it was it's negatively, he was negatively criticizing the film for depicting African liberation as being opposed to world communism as opposed to joining world communism, which is his preferred frame. And my bias in favor of the conditions of African people first had me liking that part of the film, saying that I liked that they seem to center African liberation and African interests as opposed to just subsuming African struggle within a broad world communist struggle. But having watched it again, by the third time, I think I see a little bit more of his point that that instead of trying to say, hey, communism is a good thing, but African people were sort of having their own approach initiated in their own way on their way to it. The film is kind of saying there's communism, there's radical Pan-Africanism, and the Africans chose the latter, and that's good because communism isn't so good. And
Well,
yeah,
I
that's
mean, I
what,
didn't.
yeah.
I actually didn't see it that way. I mean, I remember somebody asked Jesse one time if Jack Odell was a communist, and Jesse said, "I think Jack is a Catholic." I mean, the fact of it is, you ask somebody. I mean, I saw the answer, "Are you a communist?" No, I'm not. And look, I'm a communist. Have I ever belonged to the Communist Party? No. For real reasons, I didn't join the Communist Party. Some of my friends did join the Communist Party, and they all left for the reason why I didn't join. so, so that the fact that the Soviet Union and China was on the wrong side, in my view, in the struggle of Southern Africa, but so were many of the people in our movement. Many of the ex-SNCC people were on the side of Holden Roberto and Joseph Savimbi and what have you, because they was black, because they was nationalists, although they were calling themselves Pan-Africanists. So I didn't see that, but Khrushchev did play. All of that stuff was real, and certainly the Soviet Union wanted to have, in the struggle against the West, wanted to have influence, and the Soviet Union is. I mean, when you're dealing with European, Western people, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to dealing with us, I mean, even the communists say class is primary and race is secondary. That's bullshit. You can't deal with class in America unless you come through the national question. And they don't want to deal with that. That was the reason why I didn't join. And that's the reason why my comrades who joined the Communist Party left. It had nothing to do with not believing in communism. It had to do with the narrow-mindedness of the party itself. I mean, to my knowledge, there's never been a black executive secretary of the Communist Party unless it's been recent. There's been a national chairman. You can run for president on a ticket, because we ain't gonna win no how. But you can't be the executive secretary of the party. So I saw that as historically accurate, what I saw. And asking somebody, "Are you a communist?" Most people would say, "I'm not," and because, I mean, the influence of communism on African people, period, whether here or what have you, has to do, one, with the accessibility to a different kind of discussion. But most people I know and most people I've read, whether it's Cabral, were they influenced by socialist ideas? Yes. But scientific socialism has to be applied to particular circumstances. I mean, communism in Cuba is different than communism in the Soviet Union. It's different in a lot of ways. I mean, the European is stiff, rigid. Cuba isn't. Well, 70% of the people in Cuba of African descent. And so people who, and a lot of my comrades in the 60s made the mistake of, they were Maoists or they were Leninists. And then it got to be ridiculous. I'm a Marxist, Leninist, and Crumist. I'm a Marxist, Leninist, and Crumist Cabralist.
Cabrales. You know, we at the AAPRP are guilty a little bit of that. We're
Well,
doing that.
you know how I feel about Cabral. He's my patron saint. I got a big picture of him. So, but what I'm saying is, it's like the handshake. The handshake started off as a gesture of brotherhood and solidarity. After a while, Negroes had their hand all around your neck, you know. So, but I mean, when I study, when I read, I mean, I read Lenin a lot. I've read Marx, but I I study the methodology, how it works, how you can apply. Because if you can't apply it, I mean, if you can't apply it to your particular circumstances, then it don't mean nothing. It doesn't mean anything. You can be correct because comrades always like to say what's correct and what ain't correct. But in most cases, I would encourage people when they do analysis is one thing I would encourage people to read is Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. I think that's a must read.
Okay.
Because we are guilty of that and we get so caught up in the dogma and being correct. I mean, I had friends who wore Maoist caps and what have you, and I had people who named their kids Carl Frederick, Vladimir. I mean, to see a black kid, even in Cuba, I ran into some Vladimirs. So
that's funny.
yeah.
So, what one thing? Let me before we close, I do want to ask a little bit more specifically about the artists. If we can come back to that a little bit, when people watch Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, even if they're somewhat familiar with some of the names that we see in the film, I did want to ask you if we could talk a little bit more about who these artists were and how you understood where they were politically at the time, and maybe even headed, or even what the movement at the time was saying about what should be their relationship to struggle. Is there anything in particular that you would want to bring us to focus on as it relates to the people? You mentioned Eric Dolphy, Coltrane is mentioned, obviously Abby and Max are mentioned. I'm trying to even think of who else, but Mary Makeba,
Mary Makeba. Interesting enough, I was struck at the use of Melba Liston. And who's a trombonist. But the interesting thing I spent an afternoon with her shortly before she passed. I flew out to LA I was trying to see I knew she had a stroke and was not living in the best conditions. And I was trying to see if we could get her in the DC DMV area. So I went out to visit her. But the important thing about Melba Liston, as an artist, as a musician, as an arranger, she's arranged more music than any arranger in the history of Black music. For Motown, for Duke Ellington, for Count Basie. She's taught in Jamaica. I mean, and I always say this to these sisters, when are y'all gonna write a book about Melba Liston? So that was interesting that she's done most of the stuff for Randy Weston, who would see himself as a Pan-Africanist as in his approach to music, lived in Morocco for a long while, and what have you. But specifically, Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie are a mixed bag. I mean,
Were you? I didn't even know about his presidential campaign. Did that register for you and folks at the time? Was it ever taken anything more than just something silly?
Well, I wouldn't say silly, but it, it wasn't taken seriously, even though I have a big T-shirt that has Dizzy Gillespie for president. I mean, Diz was. I mean, he had to. You know, sometimes you get the right name. Dizzy was Dizzy. I mean, he had just certain things that he did. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the members of the band, and all the band members would shake each other's hands.
That's yeah, that's
Oh,
pretty
oh,
good.
you
That's
know,
yeah.
he was kind of a puckish character, you know, great musician and what have you. Louis Armstrong was more complex in the sense that, you know, he came from a different period. You know, came from Louisiana and all of that. But there were moments in his life when he stood up. I mean, even in the film, they had him saying that he wasn't going to the Soviet Union until they straightened that stuff up down south. I mean, he was, and at one point, uh, I think he,
And I'm sorry, just to be clear, this was not a statement against the Soviet Union. It was him saying, "I don't want to be used by the United
right,
States as an
exactly,
emissary to the
exactly.
Soviet Union
But
until
also
we get that stuff
interesting
straightened out."
enough, in the film, I think it was Trummy Young who was a trombone player in Louis Armstrong's band. And he talks about the fact that Louis Armstrong was staying at Tashambe's house, and that Louis Armstrong had commented to Tashambe, who had a lot of money, said, "Are you kind of like a bag man, aren't you?" And so Louis Armstrong, I think he was conscious of what was going on, but in typical
When I did interview, sorry to cut you off again, but when I did interview Grimon Perez, the filmmaker, he did say that what was not in the film, that he talked about how Louis Armstrong would change the lyrics of his songs depending on his audience, so that when he sang one of those songs in front of Nkrumah, he changed the lyric from "I'm white inside" to "I'm right inside,"
right,
something like that. But we don't see that in the film. But
right,
yeah, sorry to cut you off, but
yeah.
you
But
were saying, yeah.
uh, Dizzy would have, in my mind, just knowing Dizzy, uh, I booked Dizzy, took him to Barbados, and there was a guy who kept calling me up. Dizzy wants me to make the gig, you know. And I'm saying, man, who are you? Do you play an instrument or what have you? So I said, Diz, who is this guy? He said, man, he don't work for me. But the fact of it is, if I'd given that guy a ticket, Diz wouldn't have said a damn thing. So I didn't give him a ticket. But that's Dizzy. Just in, you know, having, you know, I had a lot of conversations with him, and yeah, you know, that's Dizzy. On the other hand, Max Roach was always where he was in the film. He and Abby Lincoln in that period, and
You know,
it was 1960, and a lot of things was happening in the black community. Malcolm was still alive, and Malcolm had a. I mean, for those of us who were young, Malcolm was our guy. I mean, I opened up my bookstore selling Malcolm Speaks to the Grassroots out of the trunk of my car. Went to Detroit and bought a stack of them. So, there was a lot of motion in the black community at that time, and the thing in the UN was part of an overall struggle that was going on in the black community and the consciousness of Africa, which we have not seen since then in the way that we saw it in the 60s. That people were really, I mean, everybody made a pilgrimage to Ghana, including Dr. King. You know,
yeah.
everybody, you know, that was significant. The year of Africa, the independence of African countries, and the consciousness of African leaders at that time. was much different than obviously what we see with African leaders today, or with
Well,
black leaders, or with black
hopefully with
leaders.
yeah, I was going to say hopefully on the continent some we're seeing some change happening in some places. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, but the not to get into what's happening today, but one of the byproducts of Trump and all of the craziness that he's doing, he's awakened all segments of the black community because I, I mean, when Obama had two terms, first term he had the Senate and the House, he didn't do nothing, but 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 he did invite him to the White House and they line danced and ate soul food. I think one rapper was heard to say that he smoked a joint in the White House. So that was that was freedom to him. So
well, and yeah, I forgot who the rapper was, but I do remember in before that, Willie Nelson had said he smoked a joint on the roof during the Carter administration or something like that. So I guess fair play.
yeah,
If a country singer can smoke something, let a rapper do it, and that'll signify freedom and liberation, of course,
well,
right? Yeah,
yeah, that,
but but um uh but I did, but again, like when we see, so to your point about Max Roach, I mean, this is again something that only in my third viewing of the film kind of bothered me, that all the extent to the politics that we see of these jazz artists is that UN interruptive moment. And I do have at this point the view that has been encouraged as the preferred method of reaction, like the extent of militancy that we would engage in. uh so I did want to, can you talk if you can say anything more about what were Max and the like, politically, what would he have been doing beyond what we saw in the film? What was Abby and other jazz artists or doing, or maybe not, outside of what we saw in those moments in the film? Were they engaged with any various political organizations? Were they advocating anything beyond those kinds of
well,
acts
yeah,
of resistance,
there's
etc.? Yeah.
a lot of different things happening. One, obviously, it was reflected in their music and the titles of their music, and it was. I mean, you could not as a musician have credibility in that period unless you somehow reflected through your music some connection to the struggle that was going on with black people. That's why we saw, whether it was Curtis Mayfield, uh, Rasan Roland Kirk, or Mac, or Train, to the degree that some musicians, artists were more active than others. It was later on that organizations of musicians developed, particularly among jazz musicians. The Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians out of Chicago, Black Artist Group out of um, out of St. Louis, the Collective Black Artists, and Tribe out of Detroit. And these organizations, their main goal was the creative independence and connection to the struggle of the music, but also ownership of the music. Interesting enough, most of those, and they started their own record labels. I mean, one of the struggles that black artists, whether they be musicians, writers, or what have you, have always fought for independence, control of their product. The sad part about it that most of these organizations, many of them started record labels, and to get money, they've sold the record labels back to the same people who they bought, who they started the record labels to avoid. And so, uh, but there were different levels of musicians, but Max in particular stayed true to what he was all about. Although because he was a personal friend of mine, he could be mercurial at times too. Max could turn on you in a dime, but but and Coltrane. They mentioned the fact that Coltrane went to hear Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could not avoid wanting to go hear Malcolm. I mean, the cat talking, that kind of stuff, you had to go hear him. But Train was also very clear that his interest and what he wanted to do with his music was a much more spiritual thing. I mean,
Mm.
that's where he, they asked Train, what do you think about the Vietnam War? I think all war should stop. That was Train, and then he would do a 40-minute piece called Peace on Earth. But Max did a thing for Mao Zedong. He did
Mm.
it. You look at his work. I mean, that's where most artists uh, either made their statements or didn't make their statements with their work. Marvin Gaye, what's going on? Barry Gordy didn't even want to put it out.
Yeah, I
Marvin had
remember.
to
Yeah,
put it
yeah.
out himself. So
So just quickly, also, it occurred to me just now listening to you that there are a number of folks we don't hear from in this film. That like where was Miles Davis in all of this? Like, how come why wouldn't we have seen? And was there anyone else that you think is conspicuously absent in a film like this? And why wouldn't what was Miles? What was his relationship to all this at the time that you remember? And who else might we think should have
you
been?
know, Miles, interesting enough, Miles, a statement that I heard he made. Well, he did make it. It was a video where they were talking about the blues, and Miles said, "You don't have to be down and out to play the blues." He said, "My mama's good looking and my daddy's rich, and I play the blues." Miles was didn't need music to have money because his
That's
family
true.
had money, and so in a sense, Miles was
Hmm.
there were many Miles Davis. There was Miles Davis who was arrogant and could make and say things because he had money. So in one sense, Miles was a
Mm.
labor leader, in terms
Mm.
of the music. On the other hand, Miles was I always said to people that I love Miles Davis music, but I don't think I would want to hang out with Miles. Miles was arrogant, mean, sometimes. I remember he was last time I heard Miles was in DC, and we went to visit uh, some guys who were in the band. One of them was I forget what his job was. He was either the sound man or something, but he told a story about how Miles had told the manager, he gave him some money and said, "Whatever I say, don't give me this money back." So Miles asked the guy for the money. And the guy said, "Miles, you told me not to give you the money back." And Miles said, "Give me the motherfucking money." The guy said, "Miles, you told me." Miles hit the guy and took the money. So
Damn.
so myself and the general manager of the UDC station, we were supposed to introduce Miles that evening when he played. I said, "Look, I'm gonna say what I got to say." I would say, "Look, ladies and gentlemen, Miles Davis, I'm gonna get out of the way because if this motherfucker swing at me, I'm swinging back." So that was
And that's a way to go down in history. The man that broke Miles Davis's jaw and prevented him
well,
from singing, playing his.
in that one, yeah, the one movie that Don Cheadle did about Miles running around with a gun up in
Yeah.
Harlem. Miles got shot in Harlem.
Mm.
The guy shot Miles
Wow.
in Harlem, and he said the only reason why he didn't kill him, he didn't want to go down in history as being the man who killed Miles Davis.
I'm
So,
saying that's a hell of a way to do. Like yeah.
but it's interesting. Not only that Miles was not in the movie, but none of the more progressive music that came after that period, the music from the AACM, the Black Artists Group, and whatever, none of that music was in the film. So in that
Mm.
sense, I guess he could say that he wanted to stay within that period. Uh, I mean, if there was any weakness, it did not connect itself to. I got something in my eye, and I
It's
don't
all
have
good.
a tissue. Uh, that I guess he said he wanted to keep it in that period, but I mean, I thought he could have made some connection to what's going on today. But I mean, it's
You mean artistically? Because I know, like, for instance, some of the criticism that I've heard, and I probably agree with, are the attempts to connect it to today with those car commercials, with the Tesla commercial, and then that he throws in there, and then there is reference to the ongoing plight of the Congolese, but it's not overtly made. It's not, and then there's no, but there was no attempt to connect it to today in terms of artists, uh, and the use of culture to give cover to U.S. imperialism, which of course has been done with hip hop. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, overtly said, "We're sending rappers over here to do just what we did with the jazz artists in the '50s."
oh yeah,
And to your point, I've even known a few rappers who've gotten those invitations, and admittedly, understandably, took the little bit of money and the world travel and did their thing. But at the same time, it whatever good they were able to do, it was done to serve U.S. state interests. So
and my experience has been, and I want to choose my words carefully here. Uh, that I would say the filmmaker had a good understanding of jazz or black music, but just based on what he chose. On the other hand, my experience with white writers when they write about, particularly about music, it's what is out there that they hear. It's in the folklore and what have you. It's not original, you know. I mean, because there's just certain stories that go around in particularly in the black community about musicians and I mean I read critics in the New York Times and I'm saying that they don't really know anything about that. They heard that that happened, and so I think a lot of what he was doing was based on what he heard, based on what he read about the history of that time. I mean, I I don't think the film broke any new ground, but I think it was a great film. I would say that I thought for what it was a great film. I mean, I've always said that we can't expect any film, whatever it is, to tell our story, our history, and the way in which we want it. That's not going to happen. I don't care how good it is. But I mean, like I say, I saw the film. The last time I saw it, I had a tremendous emotional reaction to just. I mean, Lumumba was just a very beautiful black man. I mean, and I was on the panel. And I said, man, I wanted to just slap somebody. you know, I mean, just the emotional reaction and the cavalier way in which they dealt with a man's life, dealt with a history of a people. I mean, the only way you can really straighten that stuff out is revolution. That's, I mean,
I think I was going to say, I think we could. That's a perfect way to end it. But go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm not crying about Trump. You know what? Because he's taken America down, and as I said and was said openly, the world would be better off without America. It is not a productive character in the world today, and Trump is taking it down. He ain't winning on nothing except every day he finds some low hanging fruit to do. I'll take over the Kennedy Center. I'm looking for him to attack the drummers in Malcolm X Park.
Wow. Now that would be an interesting contradiction, a funny contradiction.
I mean, they took the names of something off the gravestones in Arlington Cemetery of
Yeah,
blacks. I
yeah.
mean, this cat, hey, he's the best
Anything.
thing.
He's the best thing. Go ahead.
He's the best thing that happened to the world because people are saying, I mean, they dumping the dollar like mad. Japan, China, Saudi Arabia. He can't borrow no more money. The only honest thing that Elon Musk said is that if we don't do this, the country go bankrupt because we can't. Ain't nobody else taking our money.
And he might be going bankrupt himself.
Oh, he is.
So anyway, Mr. Porter, thank you very much for this.
Well,
It's always great to
thank
catch up
you.
with you, and look forward to doing it again sooner than later and get more.
Anytime.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.